I hope that the coffee that you had is going to wake you up in a couple of minutes so that you can attend to all our amazing speakers. My name is Sean Rentell. I work in Microsoft Research in Cambridge in the UK, in Abby's HXD group. And we're here to talk about the future of communication, a critical part, of course, of the future of work. Of course, in some ways, the future's always been communication, right? Everybody always asks, well, what does the future hold for communication at work? And in some ways, you know, the questions are sort of the same. Like, is it about just old ways of doing, or new ways of doing old things? Or are there, in fact, new things that are possible being made by new technologies? But how new is anything, really? And I think what's great about this particular panel is that we'll have speakers who'll be able to speak to sort of old sociological and HCI concepts, but also new ways of thinking about those things and new ways of leveraging those things for the future of work. And that's because we talk the world of work into being. And so I asked the speakers to consider these 4 questions. I asked them to ask, how should we cope with the increasing communication technologies, right? All the different ways and all the different parts of our ecosystems that we'll need to sort of talk through, talk amongst, talk across. I asked them whether there was a communicative backbone to the work environment and how that related to communication more generally. I asked them whether communication patterns are changing and how they might be able to map those. And I asked them, of course, to talk about how communication relates to productivity, broadly speaking. The 4 speakers that we've got are really tremendous and quite varied. So we have Elizabeth Stokoe, who's a professor of social interaction at Loughborough University, a specialist in conversation analysis, which is my sort of home field, as it were. And she'll be talking about agents and agents in communication, how we can build better agents, and in particular, the seen but unnoticed methods that people have for making themselves understood to one another and how that might relate to building better agents. Then we have Konstantin Sanders, a philosopher from the University of Hertfordshire, who'll be talking about how we actually deal with this sort of increase in communication technologies and talk about the concept of unhurried time, making space for unhurried time. We've then got Yvonne Rogers, amazing professor of interaction design from UCL, who will also be talking about agents, but in a different kind of way than Liz. Yvonne will be talking about looking for contextually appropriate ways, contextually appropriate methods, contextually appropriate models of interaction. And then finally, we'll have the inimitable Bill Buxton talking about ubiquity versus ubiety, or ubiety versus ubiquity. I'm never quite sure which way these things have to go, but I'm sure he will set us all straight on this. And he may also offer a few comments on the other speakers as well. We're going to run all the speakers together, and then we're going to have time for questions and discussion at the end. So please write down your questions while you hear the presentations, and then quickly raise your hands as soon as everybody's finished speaking, and then we can have a really good, sort of interesting discussion. So I'm not going to talk much more because I really want to make space for our amazing speakers. So in fact, I'm going to finish a little bit early on my section and bring out Liz to talk about her section. You got your own clicker? Fantastic.
Hello? Oh, the future of communication is bad. It's a good job I'm here to tell you about conversation analysis. This is what I do. I'm a conversation analyst, and that means that I study real talk in the wild, not talk produced in labs, not simulated interaction or role-played interaction. And I don't ask people to tell me later, post-hoc, how they talk. I study real talk. And I collect recordings, sometimes single cases, sometimes tens, hundreds, or thousands of cases of people talking in real settings, doctor-patient, police and suspect, people on first dates. And then I transcribe them in a lot of fine-grained forensic linguistic detail to try and then discern all of the actions and activities that comprise complete encounters from the moment they start to the moment that they end. I also do a lot of public science around conversation and communication. And in a way, I have the opposite challenge to most scientists when it comes to explaining what we do to, let's say, a lay audience, because something like a black hole doesn't really exist for humans to understand it. But talk and conversation is only there for us all to understand each other. And of course, we all talk, so we all think we know everything about talk already. So this is one of the challenges that I have is communicating about conversation analysis to audiences who think they already know about communication. And people ask me questions like this: will we still communicate in the future? Will AI take over our conversations? Is SMS ruining our ability to communicate with each other? And generally, I answer that question by starting with this, which is that we're always going to need to do things in interaction, at least for the career that I have left. Hopefully people will still be needing to do stuff in interaction. So they're going to need to do things like this. This is my dad talking to Alexa. All right.
I'd like to order a pizza for delivery.
Okay, I'd like to order a pizza for delivery. We're going to come back to how one orders a pizza for delivery a little later in my presentation. But I want us to start with the idea of doing things, and in particular, something like a request. So when I say that we do things in interaction, and we're going to need to probably do them for the foreseeable future, I mean things like greetings, assessments, we're going to need to make offers, we are going to want to flirt with each other. All of those things are things that we do in interaction, whether it be written or spoken. And the one action that I'm going to focus on for the rest of my talk is requests, like I'd like to order a pizza for delivery. My first example shows you how, nevertheless, when we think about a request as a broad action, that each composite word, as one builds the action, is crucial. And my example comes from a really dramatic setting, which is police crisis negotiators talking to suicidal people in crisis. And their request is for the person that they're talking to talk to them. So we're zooming in on a very, a moment. It could be 4 hours into the negotiation. It could be just like 10 minutes into the negotiation. But I'm going to show you one way in which negotiators ask persons in crisis to talk to them. Hopefully my audio will work. So here comes the request. It's going to come out in real time, line by line, so you experience the interaction as it actually unfolds. And you're going to see dots and dashes and squiggles on the transcript, which is to do with how we deliver talk. But don't worry about that. You should have the audio, which has also been anonymized.
Talk about how you are.
Can we talk about how you are? What happens next is a silence. It's only 0.7 of a second, but it's quite a long silence in my world. And I've highlighted it because I want you to notice that whatever happens next, it's delayed. So here comes the person in crisis responding to the question.
No, I don't want to talk.
No, I don't want to talk. And you should be able to hear, even through the anonymization, the sort of inverted commas around, no, I don't want to talk. I'm objecting to the very thing that you're requesting that I do. And then what happens next is more silence and a hang-up. So in this little naturally occurring experiment of real encounters, we see that requests to talk lead to disengagement in this setting. And of course, in this setting, every turn matters, because every time the person in crisis says something and engages, then they are further towards staying alive rather than jumping off the roof. However, there is another way of asking persons in crisis to talk. And it's going to work, and you're going to see it working really rapidly. So in the next clip, you'll see how quickly the person in crisis responds to this different way of requesting communication. And if it was obvious that what happens next is the thing that works, then that is what people would do. So here is a negotiator, a different negotiation, doing something a bit different.
Come and I'll speak to you.
So here, the negotiator asks the person in crisis to speak to them. And the overlapping talk from lines 2 to 3 there, I've highlighted it, you can see how rapidly the person in crisis starts to talk. Now, this is just one quick example from our large data set, but what we found was that when negotiators request to talk, people in crisis resist talking, but when they ask them to speak, they don't resist. So every word matters. And the thing is, you would never know this unless you actually bothered to look at real talk, because we don't really think that people are pushed and pulled around by language in quite this way, because we don't really look at it and we don't really take it seriously enough. Okay, here's my next example, which is that in requests, not just the words that we use to put the request together matters, but what we ask for matters, and where we go also matters. So here are two people calling the vet. And one of them is a real call. In other words, this person really does have an animal. And the other one is a simulated call. It's not a chatbot. It's a mystery shopper whose job it is to test out how good the customer experience is when phoning the vet. They don't have a script. They're just told to phone the vet and report back on how good your experience was. So here comes one of the calls.
Need puppy the other day. Just wondering how much it costs to get the jobs done, please.
Okay, and here's another one.
Hello, I wonder if it's possible to make an appointment for my cat tomorrow for a follow-up. He's had an operation.
Okay, so in case you are wondering, the first one is the mystery shopper who doesn't really have a dog. She doesn't really have a puppy at all. In the second one, it's somebody who really does have a cat, and they are phoning to make an appointment. And just very basically what you can see here is that when somebody is told, imagine you've got a pet and I want you to test out the service, they phone to find out about the cost of the service. They don't phone to do what real callers do. They don't give interactional tasks to the receptionist that actually real callers do. So we found that pretty systematically across our data sets that basically mystery shoppers do not make the same kinds of requests of the service provider. And that means that when they go back to the company and say, you know, this is our experience, they're not really telling you anything useful, I would argue. But there are even some tiny details which are, you may have noticed as the transcripts came out, which is that when people really have an animal, they tend to use the possessive pronoun, my, to formulate the request. And they don't hesitate in producing the category of animal that they're phoning about. Their hesitations, their little is somewhere else in the turn. Whereas when somebody is a mystery shopper, they're more likely to stumble and repair the production of a puppy, and they're more likely to use the indefinite article, a, to produce the animal as a category of animal rather than the possessive pronoun, my cat. So all of these things are, you might think, tiny details, but of course they matter when it comes to producing things like duplex. So here is duplex phoning to book a hairdresser appointment. Just a few lines from the opening calls that have been made available online by Google.
See how may I hear you?
Hi, I'd like to reserve a table for Wednesday the 7th.
For 7 people?
Okay, so you might think, and we could all think, that actually duplex is getting close to sounding authentic. But as soon as you start to see some of the analysis that we produce as conversation analysts, which is on the precise placement of things like stumbles and exactly how it is that people build requests, then it allows us to start inspecting these kinds of data and sort of raise the bar in terms of authenticity. Okay, so we're going to come back to pizza now for my final examples. In requests, I'm going to say turn-taking might be more important than abstract notions of context. Now, we all know that one of the challenges to producing at least turn-by-turn interaction with agents and so on is action recognition. And this is partly because we know that meaning matters and we know that context matters, but we tend to prioritize abstract notions of context over practical action. And that means that we often ignore the detailed and sequential structure of talk by emulating scripted or often stereotypical dialogue. And it's so nice, I think, to see something like the mystery shopper study, where you've basically got a human being sort of simulating being another human being and seeing how do you produce being another human being when you are one. What does it actually look like? And what can we learn about how mystery shoppers produce tasks and compare that to something like a conversational agent also producing a task? So here is a request for pizza, and here, hopefully, less quickly, this is my dad talking to Alexa, and the response.
I'd like to order a pizza for delivery.
The top search result for pizza is Kitchen Craft Masterclass Non-Stick Pizza Crisper Tray for Oven. Would you like to buy it?
Now, you might think that, well, he hasn't got the right skill. He hasn't asked in the right way for whatever it is that he might want when he says, I'd like to order a pizza for delivery. But the thing is, we can ask for pizza in lots of different ways. And interrogative grammar produces a request, can I have? Declarative grammar produces a request, pizza sounds good. You could say that pizza looks nice, and that could be treated as a request. So all of these different formats for building a request can lead to challenges. But here is the context in which we originally see why I got my dad to say, Dad, can you just record yourself asking pizza in this way? Because here is an original setting in which that turn comes out.
911, operator 911, where's the emergency?
127 Brynmere.
Okay, what's going on there?
I'd like to order a pizza for delivery.
Okay, so now what we have is a really interesting challenge, because if you Google, scam calls, fake calls, 999, time wasters, and all that kind of thing, you'll find lots of calls where people are phoning and making calls that look a bit like this. What's the date? And my cat's up a tree, or whatever it might be. But what you're going to see, and you might have guessed this already, of course, is that this is not a request for pizza. This is not a scam call. This is not somebody wasting the time of the dispatcher. What this person means is, I'm in danger, my partner's going to kill me, please send the police. That's what she means, if you like. So how is it that the dispatcher is going to discern this? And as I play you the rest of the call until the point of recognition, if you like, I want you to notice not that he's picking up on words, or even semantics, but he's picking up on turn-taking placement. So I'm highlighting the bits that I want you to focus on, and it's the point at which the caller comes back to start her turn, which is communicating to him something like, if you were pizza, this is where I would now be taking the next turn. And that seems to be what he's picking up on. So here it comes. Okay, I don't know what's wrong with the audio, but I'll keep going.
You called 911. This is an emergency line.
How long it'll be?
Okay, ma'am, is everything okay over there? Do you have an emergency or not?
Yes.
And you're unable to talk because...
Right.
Is there someone in the room with you? Just say yes or no.
Yes.
So there what we see is the call taker, the dispatcher, picking up pretty quickly that this woman who's asking for a pizza is in fact asking for the police. The police are dispatched and they save the woman from her partner. And it's gorgeous because it tells you, it gives us something to aim for, which is to understand not just abstract notions of context, but here the speaker is able to come back at line 21 there. Do you know how long it'll be? This is the point where I would be asking you that question if you were the pizza person. And he's able to discern that from turn taking. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Liz. That was phenomenal. So if you have questions about Liz's amazing talk, chilling talk, really, please write them down now so that you can ask her at the end. Now I'd like to bring out Constantine Sanders to talk about a future for unhurried time, unhurried communication.
Hi. I was going to have a handout because I'm a kind of old-fashioned philosopher, but I'm trying to persuade you that I'm not a Luddite at the end of this talk, so I thought I should stick with slides. And let's get started. So we all know about the gains of communication technology. I don't need to tell you about the gains of communication technology, but every gain has losses. And there are different kinds of losses that come with different technologies. I want to focus on psychological ones and what I'm going to call fecundity costs. And I'm using the term fecundity in sort of Jeremy Bentham's sense of if there's some utility to the technology or to anything, that utility doesn't bring further utility. So the utility doesn't reproduce. In a different sense, communication technology does have fecundity in the sense that the more you use it, it kind of replicates itself. And it's kind of designed in many cases to be used more and more. So the more you use it, the more you need to use it. But I want to say that this has a kind of cost in terms of productivity in a certain sense of the term. So for example, we might have technologies where you get notifications that someone has read your message, and it's designed so that we use it more and more. And you might think, oh, we're more productive. The more we use the technology, the more we're doing things. And I want to suggest that doing things, being busy, is not the same as getting things done. Likewise, we have all these notifications popping up telling us something's happened, check this, check that. And it makes us kind of active, but in a way which I think has a utility cost of a certain kind. Now, you'll see a message from my from a friend and scholar who I deeply respect, so I haven't put her surname on there. But I get this message, and hands up, I was on Facebook doing things, I don't know what. Hi, Constantine, I see you are constantly active on Facebook, but did you receive my email? Send a feedback, please, Marina. Now, her email had come an hour before, and it was 4 chapters of her book with a request for feedback, right? So the kind of thought that, oh, look, you haven't had time for my book, you're doing this stuff. The expectation to reply. Why? Because someone has seen that I am online, right? That's the point. They've seen I'm online and they haven't had a response to their email. And as the online-offline distinction begins to collapse, a danger is that the kind of distinction between the workplace and home or any other place outside of work also begins to collapse. So if, like me, you sometimes take a commuter train, you'll see people who are already working on their phones on the way to work and on the way back from work. But that work, while technology can allow us to not be in at work and do things from home or from wherever we need to be, it can also, in many cases, people are just working before and after work, but it's not getting rid of anything in between. So these are some of the dangers, and they come with high psychological costs. We heard in some of the keynotes this morning worries about stress, anxiety, and this sort of permanent state of work. This is from a book that Abby Sellen, who's here, co-wrote some time ago now, The Myth of the Paperless Office. And they write, the use of email in an organization causes an average 40% increase in paper consumption. Now, initially, some of that increase is because people would print out emails, and we do that a little less now than we used to. So there was this kind of treating the email as anything else and then printing it. But it wasn't the only thing. One of the things that Sellen and Harper talk about is that things that would have a high cost in terms of time or money to do physically come very, very cheap in terms of time and money electronically, like sending various kinds of forms. The longer the form, the longer the document, you would think twice about, do we really need this? Electronically, you don't think about this as much. It's just an attachment, or 3 attachments, or 4 attachments. And before you know it, you have this kind of world in which people are sending forms left, right, and center, things to fill in, spreadsheets and so on, that they wouldn't have done before. And everyone is kind of busy. And I've had colleagues in academia who feel a sense of, research can take a very long time, and they get a sense of satisfaction that I've done 5 things today because I went to the exam board and I filled those documents and I filled my 5-year plan or whatever, and I did my form for I don't know what. And there's a sense of, oh, I got this stuff out the way. I've been efficient. But actually, it's stuff that you, in a way, didn't need to do. And entire roles get created by people giving you this stuff to do. And then, so then it's their job to do it. So then they've got to do more of it. And then you're sort of thinking you're being efficient by doing these things. And so you're always doing things. But are you getting anything done? Some people talk of unhurried conversation, about slowing things down. I'm going to talk as fast as I can about slowing things down in the next 5 minutes. And there's a sense you might think that there's something sort of maybe lazy about being unhurried, strolling in the park, so on and so forth. And you might think, oh, this guy's coming here to tell us to just kind of work less. But that's not really what it's about. I'm going to give you a quotation just from a personal letter. This is from my favorite philosopher, Vick and Stein. And he says, "My father was a businessman, and I am a businessman too. I want my philosophy to be businesslike, to get something settled, to get something done." So that's got the sense in which there's something we're trying to sort out, and our work is to do it, right? There's nothing kind of lazy, relaxed, or leisurely about it in a way. He's quite an intense guy, to be honest. But there isn't this faffing around, this doing all these busybodying things. There's just the thing we need to get done. And in order to do this in various disciplines, it requires us to understand our colleagues, to understand the person with whom you're trying to get something done. And that's something which I think fast communication can be an obstacle to. Now, this is part of a general movement, and like all movements, we should be somewhat suspicious of it. I'm not going to read everything out on this list in front of you, and you'll be glad to know I'm not going to talk about everything on this list in front of you. And you can get this kind of suspicion of, well, why should we suddenly, is this just the latest fad? Why should we suddenly do everything slowly? Vick and Stein, who I quoted before, also thought that philosophers should treat each other with the salutation, go slowly. And he says elsewhere, in philosophy, the winner is the one who finishes last. That's going to be Bill today, by the way. There's this thought that when you're thinking, when you're doing certain things, you take a certain care in them if you do it slowly. And if there's the sense of, why didn't you respond to my article, to my book, I've seen that you've read my message. And so I'm on the train with all these people, and they're sort of, I can hear what they're saying, and nothing is really happening. And that's time that could be used much better. And this isn't about philosophy. This is about thought more generally. There's a book which I haven't finished because I've been reading it slowly, called Slow Media. And Jennifer Raunch writes, who wrote it, writes, many people have found their mediated lives to be too fast, too digital, too disposable, and too distracted. And she kind of tries to fight this with things like localism, self-reliance, fairness, and so on. So in a sense, what we've been experiencing is there's been this kind of phase where everyone was always on their phone, online, doing this, doing that, and then people sort of suddenly are moving towards, I don't know, listening to vinyl and sort of staying away from social media. And there's a kind of reaction to this stuff. And so there's a kind of question here, how reactive are the things I'm saying? Now, slow media and the other kind of slow things I've been talking about so far are a little different from slow communication. And I want to end with some thoughts about what I've been calling unhurried time. Now, and we heard some things this morning about the right to disconnect, for example. And over lunch, I've been talking with people with various ideas that I call patches about how to fight this kind of pressure to always be doing things but never getting anything proper done. So people have different strategies about checking email or blocking email from coming, disabling notifications, dumb phones that only let you do certain things with them, and so on. And I think while these things are all well and good, they're really just patches. And what I mean by this is that there's something negative that we're trying to kind of stop, to try and keep in control. But then they're not something positive, and it's not the creation of new technology that enables us to think slower and to get serious things done. And I think this requires reimagining what communication is for. And I think the clue's kind of in the name, information communication technology. There's an assumption that communication is there to exchange information. Its philosophical roots go all the way back to John Locke, the philosopher, but it's there in a lot of contemporary stuff. And if you think that the purpose of communication is to exchange information, then all you're really interested in is how much information can I exchange and how fast can I exchange it. So it's all about volume and speed in a way. But I think we need to rethink what technology, what communication could be for. And in this particular context, I'm interested in what it could be for within the workplace, but I think there are wider questions. I've talked a bit about understanding one another. How can we use technology to better understand one another. Speed is not often a good way of understanding other people. And I'm sure you've all experienced what happens when we all too readily reply to an email, for example. Getting things done, I've spoken about, and also other things like building camaraderie between colleagues. This is something that technology can be used for. And these are just kind of a few thoughts. I'm not trying to quickly provide an answer to everything, but I do think we need to rethink what communication is for. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Constantine. That was fantastic. All right, now it's my great pleasure to invite to the stage Yvonne Rogers.
Good afternoon. How many of you have an Alexa at home? Put your hands up. I'd say that you are representative of most people in the US and the rest of the world. They are becoming part of the family home. And whenever I tell people I do research in this area, they always tell me an anecdote about how it's changed their family life. How are these types of devices going to affect work? And my talk is going to be about thinking about how these types of voice interfaces can be used in business. I want to go back in time, though, back in the 80s when small groups collaborated. And how did they do that around technology? Well, one of them would have the mouse and the others would look on. And you might be able to grab the mouse or wait until someone would pass it to you. And then there was the vision of people in Star Trek talking to the ship's computer, where they all could interact and have multiple devices. So there's a big difference between then and the Star Trek. I want you to look at the affordances now of these smart speakers. And you can see here, this family are playing that game, paper, scissors, and stone with the device. And their attention is very much towards the device, but also each other. And so it's in the middle between these people here. Now look at where Alexas has been developed in business. And the idea is that they're going to be used increasingly at work. And it's going to be placed somewhere on a table in meeting rooms. And there are many claims that are being made about what voice user interfaces can do for businesses. And it's very apt for this conference, this summit, that the focus is largely on productivity and efficiency gains. And there's claims being made that they can provide an intelligent assistant that will help people with their tasks. In particular, providing ways of scheduling meetings while they're doing their multitasking. They can write up notes for you, make suggestions, and collect resources, all enabling people to work more efficiently. And there's also been claims made that they can improve communication. And in particular, the claims that are being made is that they will be able to listen to conversations during meetings, and they'll be able to make notes on important points, and they'll be able to help employees identify and retrieve the right information that they need at particular times from various sources. And as I already said, they'll be able to create reminders, summarize, and tasks, and so on. And so they will be these types of assistants that will do things in the background. And this is Voicera's Ava. And as you can see, she's listening to what people are saying and then writing this down and summarizing it. And we're all working in the background to make the worker's life more efficient. Now, my question is, can they be more than a flying clippy? Can we do more with voice user interfaces than have them doing our tasks in the background? And that's the research that I'm currently doing with Leon and Ethan, looking at how we might rethink voice assistants as voice collaborators. And what we're doing is trying to design voice collaborators, if you like. And we're doing this by thinking about when can they be proactive as opposed to always being reactive. So currently you will ask your voice assistant questions. And what we're thinking about is what would happen if the voice assistant could ask you questions or make suggestions to you whilst you're working. So how do we think about switching that? What sorts of roles might they play? Could they be a moderator in a meeting? Could they be a facilitator? They facilitate conversation. Could they be an instructor? They can instruct you what to do. And if we are shifting, thinking about voice user interfaces, when and how should they intervene in human conversation? Should they butt in like human beings do in conversations, or should they be more polite? And also, how should they be incorporated into the existing ecosystems, not ecologies? Thank you, Abby. So what we're trying to do is to think about how we can turn virtual assistants into virtual collaborators. And we're doing this by doing two strands of research. One is to think about how we might use AI to understand conversations and context awareness in order that when these voice assistants are going to interrupt or make suggestions, it's timely and that they don't disturb or disrupt ongoing group working. And then we think that making them human-like is also important, and not to so that people think that they really are humans, but that they are polite and they behave like humans, so people will take them seriously. And adding the ums and ahas makes them seem more human-like. So those are the two strands of research that we're looking into. And what we're trying to do is we want to not to make people's work more efficient or to optimize their tasks, but we want to amplify human cognition, to, if you like, empower people. And so our focus is not to design a general voice user interface, but for specific contexts. And we're working with Great Ormond Street Hospital, looking at how clinicians who discuss emerging data, clinical data, how we could help them to think about the data and come up with different explanations and ways in which to use that data. So just as in the previous talk, I'm all for slowing down interaction rather than speeding it up, and to get people to externalize their thoughts. And in doing this, we're arguing that this can help with creative exploration of ideas, and also potentially leading you to think differently, to go down different routes and avenues about what the data is that you're looking at, and even to see new connections. So our aim is very much to encourage more talk around the technology rather than trying to speed up what people do. So what we're currently doing is developing a system called VoiceViz, and it's a multimodal interface. And you can see the Alexa there. And Alexa, or this device here, is being designed in conjunction with data visualizations. And the way in which it works is that we have used existing clinical data, and this is about obesity levels, and that the VoiceViz can make suggestions to small groups about what they might want to look at next. And they can talk with VoiceViz to ask it to show different types of data. And this data that we're using is quite simple at the moment to make our lives easier, but it's looking at obesity levels for developing and developed countries, for boys and girls, and for adults and children. And even with those variables, it can be quite complex as to looking at trends over time. So we are modeling or trying to think about the conversational mechanisms rather than trying to do natural language processing, and to monitor aspects of the conversation as to when it's opportune or appropriate to intervene during conversation. So we're looking at metalinguistic features, the silences that might go in, the ums, the ahs, the pace of speech, the velocity of it, the number of questions asked, the body movement, the head movements. We're looking at a number of these things as to see which of these might be useful to use to know when to intervene. And our output from Visi is to make suggestions at opportune times for people looking at the data. So things like, do you need a hint for analyzing this variable? What do you think of this? Shall we move on? Did you consider the difference between developing and developed countries? What might have caused the sudden spike in the data? And if I would say one of them is slowing down in recent years, which one would you say it is? So it's constrained what Visi can say by the context, and that makes our lives a lot easier. So here we're currently running an experiment looking at whether or not having voice input and voice output actually encourages people to speak more and to discuss the data. And we're comparing it with a touch interface to show whether or not, or to investigate whether or not there is a difference in what people say and do having voice input and output, or just voice output. So we are using a Wizard of Oz technique. For those of you who are not familiar, if you look at the image on the right, that's our Wizard of Oz. He is pretending to be busy and will press buttons to give canned speech at appropriate times and can hear the participants in the other room, what they're saying and what they're discussing. So this is some of the participants, and you can see pieces of paper on the table, and those are commands that they can say to Visi to change what's appearing on the screen. And sometimes when they are a bit stuck, they've been asked to describe or to explain the data that's appearing. Visi will say something. So let me see if this will play. So they're not saying anything.
Consider how the shape of the line compares to the one of adults.
Yeah, it's a lot kind of wobblier.
So they won't say anything. Visi says something and that triggers a discussion. And then when they get stuck, Visi might interrupt.
Well, if I would say one of them is slowing down in recent years, which one would you say it is?
Adult, yeah. Children's actually quite constant.
So that, again, they weren't really sure what to say. Visi interrupts, and that triggers a conversation to continue. But Visi's only human, and sometimes Visi gets it wrong and will think that there's a silence and will interrupt the flow of conversation. And as we know in humans, we're having talking to someone and someone tries to interrupt, and that can derail our train of thought. So here is an example.
Here it's pretty much the same. Just shift.
For whom would you say was the increase more steady throughout time? For women or for men?
For men.
So they were able to get back on track. But what we're looking at is when are opportune times for the Visi to be able to interrupt and to make suggestions, if you like, to scaffold the ongoing conversation. So we're currently finishing off running our participants, comparing the voice condition with the touch condition. And these are some of the initial findings, which we're finding that participants in the voice condition, whereby they speak the commands and Visi speaks back, they speak more loudly to each other and expressively. So there's more intonation, the pitch of their voice is more loud. And that they more thoroughly explore the data visualizations that are appearing on the screen. There's more in-depth discussion and identification of trends going on, and that they will spend more time actually looking at the visualizations. Whereas in the touch condition, where they just touch a touch screen when they want to ask Visi something, they sometimes miss patterns and trends in the data. So the power of voice here is that it can trigger people to discuss more outside of what's appearing on the screen. So I'm coming towards the end of my time. We're looking at these as proposed features to model when to intervene in conversations. So turn-taking patterns, we heard in the first talk, is important. Speaker activity, shared attention, the commands given by whom, and the degree and the speed of exploration of the data sets appearing on the visualizations. So I don't have time to go through our system architecture, but we are developing an architecture by which to analyze what's being said. And just to summarize, I think that the value of voice user interfaces in workplaces, we can think differently about those. We can encourage more discussion and even more equity of participation. So Visi could say, Yvonne, you haven't said anything for a while. What do you think? And we can increase something like that. It can increase creativity by exploring different trains of thought and questions. And most importantly, we want to switch from voice assistants to voice collaborators. And when to intervene, or when voice assistants should intervene, is a key challenge. And finally, I was struck by a paper I read where it's saying that simple models of conversation can lead to surprisingly complex emergent outcomes. We don't need to do a full-scale natural language processing if you have a constrained context. And the context here is one that looking at data visualizations and discussing those. And so we're able perhaps to get by with just doing simple analysis of what's being said, what mechanisms are being used in order to think about interventions. And I think at that point I'd like to say thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. And now, last but not least, of course, we have the amazing Bill Buxton to give us some amazing thoughts, both on his stuff and also, of course, wrapping up some thoughts about the speakers.
Great. So, hello. In some sense, this whole session is each of the talks fold into the same talk from just different perspectives. But just as this session to the previous session on devices working together is another chapter in the same talk, and just as Sarah or Gloria's Mark's talk earlier is actually part of the same talk in the same session. And it's really interesting to see how these things scaffold on each other. So, and some of that's actually kind of by accident, but some of it's not. And I'll try and keep that in mind as I go along. And I'm going to start with, this is a picture of Mabel, and Mabel was a motorcycle I used to have. It was a BMW 900cc. I took it to Cambridge with me. I flew it over when you could do that for $200 from Toronto to Cambridge with my 7-year-old son. And we landed at Stansted, put on our leathers, hooked up the battery, and just drove up to Cambridge. And why am I telling you that? Because my son was 7. He had a very, very short attention span. He had some learning disabilities issues at that time. And to keep him from falling asleep on the back seat, especially because we just come on an overnight flight, I had a little microphone, and we drove to Cambridge. And I'd never had a sustained conversation longer than 2 minutes or 3 minutes with my son up in the first 7 years. I think that's maybe an exaggeration and faulty memory, but the fact was that really poor microphone with the ambient sound of the wind and everything else, for the entire drive from Stansted to Cambridge, we had a completely sustained, fully engaged conversation, one which in some senses wasn't repeated for another 10 years in terms of its coherence and length. Now, what's interesting is along that conversation, he's saying, wow, is it evergreen? It's amazing and stuff like that. But we kept the thread through that whole thing. And for me, that's always been a reminder that if you take away bandwidth and you take away modalities, you can sometimes improve the communication because it's focused and there's nowhere else to go. Even though the scenery's there, there's a different kind of distraction that caused interruptions that Sarah was talking about earlier. And that stuck with me. And so I'll give you another example how that just anecdote, which is just helps shape my thoughts, comes into this. I work with a couple of really neat people here in a project called the Soundscape Project, which is basically using 3D spatial audio to enhance mobility for people who are sight impaired. And one of the founders of that project is a guy named Amos Miller, who lost his sight just around the time he graduated from university. And he is insane, actually, in the most delightful way. He decided that he was going to run a regatta, kayaking regatta, for blind people who had never been in a kayak before and have them go into a competition on Lake Sammamish just down the road from here. And what they were doing, and this is one of the participants, and this is, I guess, last October, and the map on the right sort of shows. And what he did is he put markers, like any sailboat race or boat regatta, that you had to follow a course of 7 markers. Now, the markers were spatial markers which were put on the lake. They were virtual, locked in sound, but because of this spatial audio that enabled you to hear things outside your head, locked in space. It's like kind of augmented reality, using non-speech audio, and that's really important. The communication was non-speech. The blind person was in the helm, piloting. A sighted person was in the front of the 2-person kayak. And first of all of them, never having been in a kayak before, finished the course. And that in itself, first of all, the audacity to even do this in the first place is I told Amos, he's crazy, don't do it. And he did, and I was wrong, and he was right. But here's the point. Then we put some sighted people in the boats with the same headset, the same software, and the blind people kicked their ass. You sort of ask yourself, well, why? Because they're so ocular dominated that they were being distracted and second guessing. And audio had been pushed into the background, and they knew how to hear, but they clearly didn't know how to listen. And they didn't know how to listen with confidence. That's my theory, no proof, okay? It's not experiments, that's my interpretation. And I'd argue that there's these potentials in humans for communication which go way beyond speech. And this obsession with speech, it's important, it's hard, but it's not sufficient. But also to look at these edge cases and see where we might be able to learn. And also learn that we can provide information in the periphery the same way you can tell if it's raining or windy or if there's a car coming without interfering with the foreground task. And so you can push things into the periphery. And nearly all of our design issues have been around foreground intentional actions as opposed to background peripheral. In what in Sarah Bly and I'll come to a minute, when they're talking about big screens, thinking about them as information servers, awareness servers. How do you serve up awareness in a way that's non-interfering with your foreground tasks? And so you can actually focus and not be interrupted and integrate sometimes that knowledge. And the lessons here are really important, I think, not only because I think it's a great project, but in terms of what we can learn from it and we can bring to the rest of our practice. Now, there's this whole tension that's in AI and the things about strong, specific, weak general systems and the conflict between the two. But there's two Swiss Army knives here. Now, Victorinox that makes Swiss Army knives is probably one of the companies that was most impacted negatively from 9/11 because we used to all carry these little pocket knives with us, and none of us do who go on airplanes because they keep getting confiscated. But I want to point out the difference between the little one, which I own, and the big one, which I also own. The big one cost me about like $400. It has 80 some odd tools in it. And it's really interesting because the big one has everything, and it's useless, except as a piece of art or a piece of absurdity. Whereas the little one, which has way fewer tools, because it's always with you, and it doesn't interfere, it brings real value. But the choice of tools are really important. And yet, there's no tool in that big one, which I don't use sometimes. But what we miss in this, and I'd argue that that big one is what people have in their mistaken interpretation of what Mark Weiser meant when he spoke about ubiquitous computing. That's what they think it is, Internet of Things. We're just going to populate the world. Everything's everywhere all the time for everybody. As opposed to a few things that are the right things at the right person, the right time, at the right place that are with you. Some of which are portable and wearable with you, but the rest are embedded in the environment. And using these Swiss Army knives is a really good example, it seems to me. The primary use of that big one is on a camping trip is to use it as a boat anchor. Now, one of the ways you can look at this is if you look at that big one, these are just some of the tools. By the way, it has 2 socket wrenches, not just one. Is you get the tools. You can do a saw, spoon, fork, scissors, leather punch, nail file, corkscrew. Well, we can say, well, what's the function? But as soon as we've done that, we look at the functions and map them to the tools. You can associate a place with every one of them. So why would you have them in places where they're not typically used? And don't design so you always, well, I just might need it, I might need it. No, let's work on the probabilities. In general, this is where you need it, park it there, and then take special action for special cases as opposed to be prepared all the time. Saul Greenberg has spoken in a session before. We go backcountry skiing. Now, we can load up our packs with safety gear for every eventuality, but we're so overloaded, we're going to never get up the mountain that we're trying to climb up to ski down. You have to find a compromise and a balance in that as you do in what we do. And the core to this, it seems to me, came from an exhibition I went to, I think it was in Munich or Vienna, of Louis Kahn's work, who is one of my favorite architects. And he has this line, which I think is fantastic. Thoughts exchanged by one another are not the same in one room as in another. There's semantics based in location. And place matters. Place, space, and place and space in every dimension. Time, relative place. The photographer's here, I'm coming really close, we get a close-up, right? This is a very different thing. If it was a stranger and not a photographer, it would be a different act, even though we're in the same room. I'm in the front, but because I'm in the front, I'm the speaker, you're not. Anybody at the back of the room knows that, even if they're from a different culture. It goes beyond being in a room. It's the movement and the gesture of movement as well that's really critical. And it's within the room. And so I'll give you some examples of just some work that Abby Sellon and I and some others did at Toronto. And this is actually a floor plan of my office. And this is work that dates back to about 89 to 94. So that's my office. My desk is pretty obvious where it is. It's the one on the top left corner. And so when I'm sitting at my desk and I'm working, there's my workstation as of 1993 probably. And if somebody comes in to join me electronically from telepresence, where should they sit if we're having a conversation? Well, across the desk and principally or beside me at my desk, however you want to imagine it, but where we have a shared workspace and it's intimate because we're producing work, but a certain type of place. But I would tell you it's very, very clear that if you're a student and I'm about to give you a congratulations or say you failed, they're going to sit on the far side of the desk. I'm going to be sitting this side, and they would never come back to my side. That's something that Abby would do because she's a close colleague, but that's a level of intimacy and permission that if you're there and I'm here, I'm Professor Buxton and you're not. And it's a formal stance. If you're a colleague and a friend, it differs. There's these permissions. This is called the moral order. And this is kind of stuff that I've learned from Richard Harper, that this whole notion about how we start to define space and movement. And from these knowledges, which are culturally specific and can evolve, we can decide how to make informed decisions to limit where we put technologies that don't need to be there in the first place. So we can always try to keep to the minimum necessary to achieve our goals. And we say the same thing. If somebody comes to the door, I know if they're at the door in the middle of talking to Abigail and we're having a conversation, I can completely and politely ignore them. And if I ignore them for 15 seconds, they know I see them, I know they see me, and they will leave. And I'm not going to interrupt the flow of the conversation because they have that awareness that I'm in a conversation and they know the moral order and the social mores, and they will just depart in about that amount of time because of where they're located. They're not in the room, and away you go. And so you build a proxy to do that. So we place the video there. And what I'm trying to say here is by putting more of the right technology in the right place for the right function, then you have less complexity. For every location in this room, there's a place for the remote person to occupy in a manner that's consistent with the social mapping of that space. And so even when they're approaching down the electronic corridor, you use earcons so you can hear the virtual footsteps coming. So as they approach, you can hear them coming, so you can prepare. It's not a sudden switch. It's an analog, gentle approach, because this approach, graceful approach and departure, which came up in Sarah's talk, it came up earlier today, in this session as well. And then if you are going to sit around in a collegial way around the table, there should be a place there to occupy. And if you do not have those things, the conversation is going to be broken because you cannot transfer the skills that you've acquired from a lifetime and living in the everyday world to this hybrid virtual physical space and so you have to think of all these ways to go over these speed bumps. And you cannot have flow. You cannot have uninterrupted. And if you look at your conference rooms, for example, how we think about these things, and by the way, this has nothing to do so far with what the technologies are. It's simply where they're deployed. And remember, this has all been done and working and functioning in the late 80s and early 90s. When I'm giving a presentation at the front of a conference room, I'm up front, my work is up front. This is before you had projectors that cost less than $100,000. And so we had at the time what I thought was a huge display, but I'm working there and I can write on it with a light pen and away you go. But when Gail is now, you're looking at it from the front of the room, presenting to the group, the audience is in front of her around the table. And there's a proxy at the back so she can see one of the team members who's from Ottawa putting up their hand to ask a question. And they're seated where the audience is seated. Even today in Microsoft, And typically, if I come into a meeting, I'm on the projector at the front, 10 times bigger than anybody else in the room, peering down, and it's completely inappropriate. And it's got nothing to do with her ability to have the technologies. It's not understanding the relationship of technologies, function, place, and what the moral order is, and how conversations work. It's the social science and the architecture that's broken, not the technology, the digital technology. But the main point is, there's a total awareness of what's doing, and you can use the skills. Raise your hand. You got a question, that's fine. I don't have to turn around and see this person looming over me. Do you have a question? And likewise, if the remote person's there, they have a separate space where they appear on the smaller screen, and their talk is on the big screen. You do not put if you have your face of the remote person on the same screen as the work, with the camera somewhere built in the screen, it's already broken. It's not about interface design, it's out of my face design. Get your face out of my work, that's my work's place. But I'd love you to be here so I can have gaze awareness that you're here and the work's there, and I can direct your voice is going. This is all things, attributes of how we design and lay out the technology, architecturally, if you will, that actually takes out the speed bumps, gets rid of these interactions. And if you start to go back, and if you had this type of architecture, I would love to have Gloria's studies about where the eyes go redone, because they would change dramatically, because actually the movement from eye to that screen would show the continuity of action and the continuity of conversation as opposed to the disruption of the conversation. It's not about the screens. It's about the content of why you're going to the screens and how these things chunk together. And if we come back where the task space is in fact the person, they're just giving a talk with no slides, then they should be up at the front full size, in the case where you only have a big screen, a little screen at the front. So what does this all bring us to in terms of how we think about things? So I actually had the pleasure of working for a number of years with Mark Weiser on when ubiquitous computing was coming up, and this sort of most intensely from, let's say, 89 to as late as 94. But in his paper, the Computer for the 21st Century, he talked about ubiquitous computing. He talked about this notion of ubiquity, which none of us knew the word. We all had to look it up. But these two principles is that things were everywhere you needed them, and they were transparent. That sounds like a paradox, but my example of that is simply saying, if you walk in my house and you come to the living room and the dining room, and you see a dining room table in the dining room, and then you have to go to the washroom, and you see a toilet in the washroom, you come out, you're going to ignore it. It's transparent. In the same house, the same person, everything else, I put the toilet in the dining room and they put the dining room table in the bathroom. All of a sudden, it violates the moral order, and you will notice that really well. I mean, you're probably going to start questioning the relationship with me that's the situation. I'm just saying it's not about the visibility of the toilet or the dining room table. It's where they're situated. And is it appropriate to the purpose and the function and the moral order of that particular culture? And so what happened is ubiquitous has this notion, and its definition, if you look it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, is everything everywhere all the time for everybody. It's ubiquitous. And we think about that because we're geeks and think about the technology because we're materialistic. We think of that everything is everywhere, as opposed to everything we need is everywhere we need it. That's okay, but that's not how the Internet of Things and so on interpret it. Mark used the wrong word. There's another word that's adjacent, a close cousin, that I only discovered because I was trying to look up. I'm obsessive with this kind of stuff. There's a few things I'm anal about, and one of them is I really want to understand language. And I accidentally, in trying to get the precise definition in the OED for ubiquity, I came across a word, ubiety. And ubiety has a very different notion. The core of it is this notion of place. It has this thing, and place in every dimension. What Mark talked about was ubiety, not ubiquity. And likewise, nobody knows this term, so therefore it's neutral. It's unencumbered with baggage. And so one of my things here is this, by changing our language, let's switch over there. So I believe that we can get rid of the speed bumps. And we can get rid of them by using this notion of design, thinking about things architecturally, and understand that, and this comes back to the early talk, to get away. Besides, part of communication is to be able to commune with nature, commune with your environment, commune with your family. And so you have that peace, and it is slow, and it can be peaceful. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Thanks.
All right, so I want to invite now all the speakers back onto the stage, and we can have some questions I'm sure you've been industriously writing down during the time. All right, here they are. Bill, Yvonne, Liz, and Constantine. So some questions from the audience.
Turn on? Is that on? Great. Thanks, everyone, for all of those inspiring talks. I wanted to explore this notion of conversational agents and whether they need to be human-like. So this is something that you said, Yvonne. Can you unpack that a bit? Because there are many reasons why you might want to do that or not do that. So is it about natural language understanding? Is it that they're contextual? Is it that you want some notion of emotion embedded in these? And especially in a business context, why is that important? I'm not sure that I completely buy it, so maybe you could convince me.
That's a good question, and I think we made that decision as to not to how is our voice assistant going to appear if it's going to interrupt? Would people take it seriously? Would they listen to Vizzy saying something? And we thought if we made it more human-like, they may, based on earlier work from the Stanford NAS, that if it's polite, then people will respect it. So that's basically our take on it. It's not about emotional contact that people will relate to it more. It's more that they'll take it more seriously. And in this context, the business context, we think it's important that they will listen and they will respect what the agent is saying. I think in other contexts, it may be that you don't want it to be human-like. And I think the ongoing debate about duplex, about whether you're duping people into thinking it's human, when in actual fact it's an agent, I think that's a different context, and people don't like the fact that they're being duped. In this context, we're using it, people know it's an agent, and it's been designed to be polite and civil.
I want to get a clarification, because there may be a duplex means it's two-way conversation as opposed to duping. So in telecommunications, but the 2 points are perhaps ambiguous, but also in speech, the languages are using spoken language in both cases. And the thing I find interesting in some cases that that's less common in the physical world is that speech is answered by non-speech or by gesture or by some other mode. And that's far more common when we deal with technology, and therefore the two directions could be in completely different modalities.
I agree, and maybe they have to compensate for the fact that you can't gesture if you're a voice assistant, and to think about how you can do that. And so, having the ums and the ahs, maybe, and the way in which we use those in human speech can compensate for the fact that you're not being able to gesture and use non-verbal body language.
Which is what we do on the phone, of course.
Yes.
In your case, it's really interesting because having a video phone would preclude ordering pizza, and it would be another example where it would be damaging. It would be wrong. You'd lose that opportunity to that person take that strategy of ordering pizza, which is pretty.
I noticed that in your example, Liz, also you had, your example of Google Duplex had an before the very last word, seventh. Is there a reasoning that you know about why they decided to delay that last particular piece of information? Because in Yvonne's talk, she said there might be some value in putting in ums and ahs. So one value might be to delay. What might be the value of delay, or for that example, but maybe more generally?
Well, there were some colleagues and myself who were looking at those very small number of recordings that Duplex have released into the wild for people like me to look at. What we're trying to look at is what is Duplex doing that is sort of passing for human, and where is it not really passing for human. So we're looking, for example, at the precise phonetic qualities of the ums and finding where they are in duplex's overall speech, sort of pitch range, for example, and finding it's not just that the ums and ahs may or may not be in the right place in overall turn construction compared to a human being booking a hairdressing appointment, for example, but that the onset of the pitch is not quite how you would expect a human to use that as well. And it's not really that we're trying to be critical of duplex. It's more like if you really want to push it as far as you can, then you need to take seriously that you can find out this kind of stuff when you study real humans booking hairdressing appointments, for example.
Another question? Oh, there's one here.
Konstantin talked about all of this sort of acceleration that technology is imposing on us, making everything happen really, really fast. And so I wanted to toss out one way in which it may be going the opposite direction. I have found over the past years that sort of messaging mediums, texting or Messenger or whatever, they allow these conversations to happen where sort of the turn taking is on the order of hours. And so the conversation can be the sort of day-long conversation where you don't have the rush to immediately answer. You don't need to have the right thing to say right away. You can sort of think a little bit before the next step. And so, and yes, if you think of them as isolated messages, there may be this sense of rush, but over a longer time span, there is this kind of coherent conversation that's happening that could not happen in person because nobody would be willing to wait that patiently for the responses.
Yeah, thanks. No, that sounds right. And one thing I wanted to say was, in a way, what I was trying to do isn't quite the slow media and the other slow movements, because they have this sort of sense that almost everything should be slowed down for its own sake or something like that. That's maybe exaggerating a bit, but that kind of thought is there. Whereas we do want a technology that's flexible between the times when we do want to do things maybe quite fast for a few minutes and then leave hours or days before something else, and depending on distance and other things. So yeah, I don't disagree with that. I suppose what you say can work better in. So if the people having the conversation sort of understand this, then it works really well. It can work harder in cases where the employer has maybe more power than the employee. So it will kind of vary from situation to situation. Thanks.
Just to jump in quickly, I've looked at people who are starting their first dating and they're messaging each other on something like Messenger or WhatsApp. And so if a tenth of a second is about the average gap between people in a conversation, what you notice the interactant's doing is kind of calibrating this is a normal pace for us, and then becoming accountable or becoming someone who probably isn't that keen on you if they're leaving now what is a much lengthier gap than what we had been previously doing. So you can kind of see people calibrating that in something like early dating.
The quick comment to trigger from that's for that question is my wife and daughter have an ongoing game of Scrabble, especially only when we're traveling. I've never seen them play Scrabble live, face-to-face, ever. And so a couple times a day, they'll just make a move here and there. It's not demanding, and it's not about playing Scrabble. It's just a way of touching, intimacy, and saying I love you and I miss you. And that's it. And it's asynchronous, there's no pressure. And so the message has nothing to do with Scrabble. Scrabble is just a medium of saying it in a way that, how many times can you say I love you, right? And I think that aspect of communication there's the dark side of it. It's kind of like one of the white hat things that's interesting, that's not planned, but opportunistic, that's neat to call out though, because what else are we missing?
Yeah, no, that's lovely, because it's an example where you're not trying to, you don't have a particular goal in every kind of
And it's
move.
slow.
And it's
of your
slow.
type, yeah. I've never thought about it that way until you talk with that question.
Yeah, thanks.
Great.
How many points do you get in Scrabble for I love you? No, more seriously, I want to follow up, please, on your comment. So now we have, I mean, if you look at conversations, we have face-to-face conversation, and we have phone conversations, and now we can have texting conversations, or we can have email conversations. What happens is the term conversation is carried out with different media, and how does it change when you analyze them?
Is that to me, sorry?
Yeah.
Well, I would go back to the thing that I said right at the start of my talk, which is that people still need to get stuff done. So I had a PhD student a few years ago who was looking at people live constructing messenger chats, for example, because she was interested in when people are just friends and they are talking, how can we compare how people are doing it on Messenger to how they might do it on the phone, because we know a lot about how people talk on the phone or face-to-face. And so we were looking at the live construction of messages and what eventually got sent, which of course is a bit different from how things are put together. And when it comes to something like a request or an invitation, then we can see that people are oriented to the same kinds of contingencies and matters at stake that they might be in face-to-face conversation. So you'll see people building, would you like to delete? Do you want to delete? And doing the kinds of things that we see people doing in face-to-face or telephone conversation, and taking that time to sort of precisely design their turn for that recipient. It's just that, of course, when you're face-to-face, you can't hide the fact that you're stopping and starting that you can do when you are on Messenger. So my gorgeous moments are things like people writing XXXXX, cursor is sort of sitting there, delete all the kisses, put 2, delete them, and then send a sticky out tongue. And I'm just thinking, what would that look like in real life? But yeah, but basically the answer is that if you start with action and people have to do stuff, then some of these things that we imagine are very different aren't quite so different.
That's a really important point, though there's something very subtle here, that we've all talked about situated context, and everything's best for something and worse for something else. But here's the key thing. We talk about mobile. We think about the phone, the physical device, but it's actually the activity that's mobile. And what's interesting to me in terms of these different situations is when I'm moving around and moving from context to context, how do I sustain the conversation with whatever modalities are available to me or appropriate? And so if I'm coming down the corridor talking on the phone, I have to describe, for example, if I'm up by a whiteboard or if here physically I can use a dictic gesture to point and indicate. But there's lots of other ways too. And so one of the things that's a design challenge for those of us working in research in this area is how do we make the conversation be coherent and fluid and have flow as I move through the ecosystem and can do the best I can in with the available resources that are available. And so we have to know the points, but the transitions are actually as or more important than the solutions at any single point. And that's understudied. I mean, it's not studied enough. Understudied's got a double meaning.
This is for Bill. I've had the pleasure of hearing you explain why it should be ubiety and not ubiquity, and I totally buy into it. It's in all my talks now. But as you enumerate all these various roles in which a communication can take place, and all the various roles that the various actors can take, all I can think of is, oh my God, the computational complexity of the cross-product of all of these roles and devices and places, in your sense, is mind-boggling, and I don't know how to design for it. What is our design principle for this kind of true communication?
So Ken Hinckley, I thought, said some wise things in his talk just before lunch on the connected devices. Said, we have all these, we can enumerate all of this super connected graph that's super complex, but actually in reality, the vast majority of those arcs in that graph have in their critical path a node that says magic happens here. That is, we don't know how to do them. So we can just prune those for now, and that makes this problem much simpler. What we can do is we can do the best we can, which is better than what we're doing now, because a lot of the things I described have been avoidable for a decade and just not acted on. So it's it's really important. This is the hardest part as a researcher, is you describe a vision, but that's this aspirational, but it's not what I'm advocating that we do tomorrow. It's just that's the driving principle. Now, where's the low-hanging fruit? And anyhow, we don't know, and so at least in picking the low-hanging fruit, we'll get the insights that will help us go further and figure out where we might have insights, or as soon as something comes up that we didn't expect, exploit it in the most effective way and not have to get a bloody nose along the way.
I would also add that people are very adaptive and they can appropriate different technologies, whether they're speaking on the phone, whether it's video conferencing, and they understand the affordances of that technology and will speak slowly, or they will, they're very good at picking up. So we don't always have to be designing for the perfect flowing conversation, because I think people are quite good at working it out for themselves.
My name is Chela Rajan. I'm with the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. I don't work on digital technology, so this has been a fascinating day for me. But I wanted to pick up on something Konstantin said about, he used the term, he's not a Luddite. And I want to sort of speak a little bit in defense of Luddites, partly because I think the slow movements and the refusal of work, the anti-productivity movements, I think they're telling us something that we ought to pay attention to. Even the original Luddites were really sort of not against technology per se, but against the sort of industrial technology and the kinds of tools associated with that. And their crisis was a crisis of a loss of craft, a loss of social solidarity, and so on. In fact, one of the words that I think has gone missing from our conversation is the word solidarity, which was one of the three terms of the French Revolution. Fraternité has sort of gone away because it leads to a certain sort of emergent outcome that we've forgotten how to sort of articulate and think about. I was wondering if some of you could comment on what some of these technologies might do in order to sort of enhance social outcomes, emergent outcomes like solidarity.
I mean, the reason why I was resisting the term Luddite is that there are so many ways in which, for me, professionally, technology has made my life much easier and much better. So I didn't want to sort of come across as and specifically what's called information communication technology has made my kind of day-to-day life, in terms of work-life balance even, much better. So while I was kind of criticizing it, and it does have this really nasty side, for me the solution isn't to either do away with or minimize it kind of across the board. That can have positive effects for certain people at certain times, but I was kind of more interested in how to rethink technology to enable various kinds of slowness, I suppose. And if that's compatible with Luddite, then I'm happy.
Bill or Yvonne or
anyone?
Liz, you want to have a crack at how you design for emergent properties of social interaction?
Well, you can start because you've been thinking about it a bit more. But
well, I just think one of the interesting things is the idea, I guess, of how, especially if we think about turn taking and conversation analysis, how every turn proposes a next action, and then those actions propose forward actions. They propel us through an imagined social space. And not just one, of course, the multiple potentialities. And any turn that is received by somebody, they don't have to sort of accept, as it were, the proposed ticket of what they're going to do. They can choose to go another kind of path. And we're all kind of, I think, imagining multiple sort of social realities at certain levels as we move through things. So I guess what I'm interested in is technologies that open up the spaces for where might I go. And actually that was sort of one of the things that I really liked about Yvonne's talk, is proposing a space for, I'm not quite sure I can imagine exactly where to go with this other resource, this visualization. So tools that can sort of simply provide just a little bit of a nudge to then put me into the next sort of imagined space. I think those sound really exciting. Do you want to jump on that?
Yeah, no, that's very much behind our thinking, is that often we design interfaces, graphical user interfaces, to speed up thinking and to get people to get to a solution as fast as they can. And so you can set filters up and then quickly the system will give you a result. We're trying to do the opposite by slowing them down, whereby, you know, there's something there and you have to make it, you have to come to some decision, or you have to interpret or make sense of that data. And the system could just, you know, say, well, I think it's this. There's a correlation between this. Obesity is, you know, increasing in developing countries because of all the fast food and so on. And it could make the suggestions. But what we're trying to do is to encourage people themselves to think through and to externalize their thoughts. And that's the kind of slowing down. So having these kinds of suggestions or nudges, or saying, well, why don't you look at this data, or have you thought about looking at that, can, you know, guide the conversation in certain ways that wouldn't have otherwise. And then that can lead to different thoughts and different ways of making connections with the data. And we're just using visual data here, but it could be in teaching kids. And it could be in all sorts of contexts as to how you might guide and open up and slow down people's thinking.
So the comment I have, and it's really interesting because it's reflected implicitly in this session and this previous session on connected devices, is it's about future, what's the future of X, right? And here's the deal in terms of statistics and all the studies about the evolution of technology. If you're a historian of technology, just look at the National Academy of Science reports that come out every 5 years on the evolution of telecommunications, biotech, and information technologies. Everything takes about 20 years at least to get from a first inception articulation to the time it hits prime time. And it's only in about the last 5 years that you get the hockey stick where it comes up to general awareness. It's always there, it's always accessible, it's always visible. You just have to know where to look. And it's just a question of how good are we at prospecting. So when people ask me about the future, what's going to happen in the next 5 years, and why I sometimes appeared to be Mr. Smarty Pants pretending I know, well, it's not because I'm anything other than a bit of a prospector. I've already seen 15 years of history to inform what's going to happen, what's possible to happen in the next 5 years. So, for example, it's not necessarily some new technology. There's no Deus Ex Machina that comes out and does it. What there is, for example, on turn taking. When you're driving your car and you're in the middle of a conversation, no matter how intelligent the speech agent is that's giving you directions, guess what? It's got a microphone. It can hear what's going on in the car. It doesn't pay attention at all. It just steps right on top of you. So it has no turn taking in terms of knowing when to come in terms of the social graces. It just violates everything. It's just wrong. And second of all, in many cases, it could deliver the information about turning in non-speech audio, which in a way uses a different part of the cortex, so you don't need that speech, and you could actually maintain your conversation, which may have to do with rote finding, and give it to you, and you get both those channels simultaneously without task interference. So there's a whole range of things like that. It's simply how do we better use, knowing what we know from the social sciences and so on, and about communication science, to leverage the technologies that are already there, maybe in their infancy, so that by the time the cost benefit of mass economies of scale occur, or we want to trigger it, we can actually do it right and not have to struggle through the kind of things that happened with mobile phones where they were ringing everywhere because we had the technology, but we hadn't designed the affordances that would accelerate the adoption of appropriate social conventions in their usage.
Let's get in one last question. We got up there.
So I want to say thank you to all the panelists for really interesting, diverse, provocative presentations. The question that I want to ask has to do with the title of the session and the ways that it manifests differently in each of your talks, right? So you have Bill talking about communication is to commune. You have Constantine talking about communication isn't just information exchange, it's understanding each other. You have Elizabeth talking about people understanding each other in these really interesting, fraught, emergent contexts. You have Yvonne talking about, communication is like the virtual agent or the voice agent prompting you to think in a different way. And I find myself wondering what the common thread is. Like these all feel like really provocatively different approaches. When you, the four of you, reflect back on it, what's the thing that you see tying it together as being about communication?
They complete me. And vice versa, I think. We all gave the same talk. In some ways, I think that's my feeling. I don't know. We just filled in each other's gaps. The answer is yes.
I think you felt more tensions across our talks than we did. So I want to hear more about why you think these are radically different. I was kind of thinking, oh, we're all kind of quite similar in a way. So I'm pleased to hear you don't think this. But
I don't know that it's radically different. Okay. I don't know that it's radically different, but you're all emphasizing different aspects of it. Or it's sort of like the silly analogy with the people and the elephant, right? Oh, it's a thing with tusks. It's got big ears, whatever. And I guess what I'm trying to understand is what is the whole? Like, how does this fit together to make an agglomerative piece?
I think the 4 questions that were asked at the beginning, we hadn't seen them till they appeared.
They were in the email, just saying.
You just haven't read them.
We just haven't read them because we get so many emails. But I think it was also communication at work is a very broad title for the session, whereas some of the other sessions they're much more specific, so you may see more commonality across the talks. But I think what you got here was rich diversity of how you can think about communication at work. And from the philosophy to the social aspects, conversational, theoretical analytic approach to future technologies. So I think you've got a smorgasbord, if you like.
But it's also Sean's evil genius of actually absorbing Constantine's message and saying, you'll find out tomorrow, as you absorb it.
And if I can quickly say, I think obviously what communication might be best used for will really differ from one profession to another, one work context to another. So I was kind of giving a few examples, and maybe we're all giving a few examples from contexts that we've been working in or are used to. But it's not as if there's a sort of catch-all, this is what it should be used for in the future, because it can be radically different. Though I'm always shocked every time, like, the plumber comes and even he has to like do some emails. So maybe there is some similarity across the board.
Yeah. I think for me, I study people interacting in workplaces of diverse kinds. And I don't really study, I'm not a computer scientist, and I don't know very much at all about a lot of the questions and answers that you all know. But for me, one thing that it does connect us a little bit is this idea of continuous conversations, lapsed conversations, having to pick them up, multimodal conversations and slowing them down. And it all comes together for me in those crisis negotiations, which could be 9 hours long, where there is no technology, there is no extra resources that you can bring to bear. You stop and start, you have to stop and start, and the only thing that you can do is actually use your voice to keep someone talking. And it's kind of mundane in a way, and it's just human skill, and that's the only thing that you can do for 9 hours. So I like the fact that you talked about slow and you talked about lapsing and starting and restarting, and that it's someone's workplace, and it's very ordinary. But it's important to look at the very, very ordinary.
Yeah, there's a lot of skill in the very ordinary, I think, is what ties this together. All right, so we're slightly over time, but thank you so much. Can we thank all of our panelists, speakers one more time? And I believe there's now networking time, so you can go out and talk even more to the speakers. Thanks very much.